Our reading this morning is from Deuteronomy chapter 34. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zoar. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab, 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those miraculous signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials, and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of Israel. Here ends the reading.
Thank you, Shirley. Shirley was saying this morning, just before, that there's quite a few awkward names in that little talk. I've just stupidly realised that I'm going to repeat some of them now, but never mind. Okay, as you know, the rector has been started preaching on the kingdom of God, but today I'm going to finish our series on the book of Exodus. But hang on a minute, because today we're in Deuteronomy. Not sure how that works. Maybe that's why I'm preaching this week, and next week is Back to Church Sunday. But wait a minute, we've got some breaking news. We've got some breaking news, Jan. Yep, thank you. Okay, an unconfirmed report from Mount Nebo is saying that Moses, the leader of the fledgling state of Israel for the last 40 years, is dead. The man who was on the verge of taking his people into the occupied territory of Canaan, the former homeland of the Israelites, having reportedly told his followers he would not be joining them when they crossed over into what he termed the promised land. It's now believed that he died on the mountain itself, although his body has not yet been recovered. I apologise to Niall for my efforts at copying journalism. But I appreciate as well that we're a few thousand years late for breaking news, and even the Portadown Times would be ahead of me on that one. But that's probably how Moses' death would be reported today, because the death of such an inspirational global leader would surely impact on so many, even on those who have never met him. Back when I was a schoolboy at Killigamane Junior High School all those years ago, and I do mean the last century, I still remember the morning when our headmaster announced at assembly the death of Donald Woodman, the former headmaster of Portadown College. Mr. Woodman had come out of retirement to teach part-time at Killigamane. He taught Latin. Frankly, I was terrible at Latin, but Mr. Woodman was wonderful. He had been a great and formidable leader in our local education, as well as a fine servant of this very church. Mind you, we have another headmaster of Portadown College in our congregation today, so I have to be careful about making any comparisons. David Riley wasn't a man given to displays of conspicuous sentiment. More likely to be telling the people on the Birches bus to stay behind after assembly. The people on the Birches bus were always being told to stay behind after assembly. But the emotion in Mr. Riley's voice that morning spoke for all of us who were fortunate enough to have been in Mr. Woodman's classes at Killigamane. And he was a local man with a big reputation that spread well beyond the limits of this town. And as I said, it's a memory that lives with me to this very day. But the thing is, no matter how great someone is perceived to be, in the end, we're all just flesh and blood. Change is inevitable, and somewhere there's always someone else waiting in the wings, ready to step up and take over. No one is indispensable, because only God endures. So now Moses has reached that point in the epic journey of his life. He's now 120 years old. That may seem quite ancient to us now, but remember, his father lived to 138, his grandfather to 133. And surely Israel could ill afford to spare him at this time, with the conquest of Canaan still ahead of them. Moses had brought his people out of Egypt, but only after a long and deadly struggle with Pharaoh. He'd gone through all the fatigues of 40 years in the wilderness, shaping and molding a new nation, establishing God's laws and the rites of worship that would last for generations. He'd faced down rebellion and discontent, interceded for his people before an angry God. But yet now he was to be denied the final triumph of entering into Canaan, which surely would have been the climax of his life's work. So how did it come to this? Well, we know that God had been angry with all of the Israelites that he brought out of Egypt because they hadn't trusted him when the chips were down. He says in chapter 1, verse 35, and hopefully we'll get that on the screen. Maybe not. He said, "Not a man of this evil generation shall see the good land I swore to give to your forefathers." Hence the 40 years spent in the wilderness. And then in verse 37, he indicates that Moses was also to be included in this. He says, "Because of you, the Lord became angry with me also and said, 'You shall not enter it either.'" But there was also a reason concerning Moses. Angry with his people's complaints when they were at Meribah. Moses had twice struck a rock with his staff. Water had gushed out, enabling them all to drink. But in doing this, he himself had incurred God's anger. God tells him in Numbers chapter 20, verse 12, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of all the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." So in the face of all that he had done right, Moses must still suffer. As leader of the people, he was to be punished for the sin of the people. And this must have sat hard with Moses. And at first we're told that he prayed earnestly for its reversal. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 23. "At that time I pleaded with the Lord, 'O sovereign Lord, you have begun to show to your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do these and the mighty work that you do? Let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan.'" But God's response leaves him with no room for maneuver. "That's enough," he says. "Do not speak to me any more about the matter." And of course Moses simply obeyed and pleaded no more. But God also promised Moses that he would be allowed to see the promised land. So here we see him at the start of chapter 34, beginning his ascent of Mount Nebo, alone, but in fact not alone, because God is with him. And from the top of the mountain, God shows him the whole land. From Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev, and the whole region from the land of Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar. And yes, he's at the top of a high mountain, but Moses would have been able to see all of this. This is God giving him the grand tour, turning him round like the beacon of a lighthouse. This was God's final reward to Moses, just before he died. And if God has reserved the discoveries of his grace to Moses to be the support of his dying moments, then what a reward. Isaiah said Canaan was Emmanuel's land. So in fact, here was a view of the blessing to come in Christ. And like Simeon, having seen the salvation of God in the infant Jesus, Moses can now say, Lord, now let thy servant depart in peace. And so we're told very simply in verse 5, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. Moses had completed his life's mission. He'd handed over the reins of leadership to Joshua to take the Israelites into the land he knows he can never enter. And hero or not, all of us must come to that moment when we have to leave our earthly bodies behind and move on. Yet we have no sense at this point of Moses being in any physical decline. In fact, he's just climbed a mountain 4,500 foot high, nearly a mile. If you've ever climbed Slade Down, you'll know how hard that is. And that's less than 3,000 feet. Michael Parkinson, when he interviewed many famous celebrities on his Saturday night TV show back in the 70s and 80s, but one of his favourite guests was actually a very humble woman. Her name was Catherine Bramwell Booth. She was the granddaughter of the Salvation Army's founder, William Booth, and herself an officer of that organisation. Now, at the time of the interview, she would have been about 95 years old. And Parkinson was very visibly charmed by this sprightly old lady who said she would chop up firewood at her cottage every day while berating her younger sister, a mere stripling in her late 80s, for failing to keep up with her. She was someone who spoke with disarming simplicity and common sense. Look her up on Google and you'll find this quotation that makes some philosophy. Show mercy. No soul was ever made poor by loving too much or injured by forgiving too often. A fine sentiment. But the moment I remember from the Parkinson show was when she asked if she was looking forward to reaching the age of 100. Her reply was, "Oh, I do hope so. And I would love to be like Moses. He lived to 120, you know, and yet the Bible tells us his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone." How wonderful. But of course, even now I have to wear glasses. Catherine Bramwell Booth would eventually die in 1987 at the age of 104. Not too bad. So Moses, having experienced a visual feast of the promised land, can now look forward to an even greater heavenly vista, the land of which Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him." And then God says, "That's it, Moses. Now, come on home." And in humble acceptance and without self-pity, Moses obeys. Yes, he was 120 years old when he died. But remember, Moses was still in vigorous good health. And as I said earlier, his immediate ancestors lived to be older still. Then, as the saying goes, only the good die young. Moses was alone when he died. Join him. Aaron was already dead. And wouldn't we say today, how terrible to die alone without any family around for comfort? But Moses died securely, according to the word of the Lord. So he had no need to fear. In death he could trust in God, just as he had done time and time again during his own life. Now I realize the thought of dying brings up all kinds of strong feelings. Everything in us longs to hang on to a dying loved one. Many have experienced that bedside vigil. I was fortunate in that both my parents died peacefully. But if the person is in obvious pain, then every minute of prolonged life and agony for the dying as well as the person watching on, it is only natural to hope and pray for death to come and take the pain away. But yet even when it does so, just as natural to think you would give everything to see that person alive for just one more day, one more hour. Moses teaches us, however, that the believer has no reason to fear or run from death. Many years later, Paul would echo the same thoughts when he said in Philippians chapter 1, verse 22, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain." We all die. Perhaps ironically, that's what life is all about. After death comes burial. And in the case of Moses, this was no ordinary burial. Remarkably, verse 6 tells us that he, God, buried him in Moab, valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. Moses is the only person in the Bible whom God personally buried. And then he hid the tomb. So why would he do that? Moses was one of the figures of history. He was unique. But ultimately, he was just a man in the service of God. And on his death, all his fame, all his fortune, all his experience, all the things we would normally hold on to, went, nothing remained. God didn't want his tomb becoming a shrine to distract from the message. And I can't help thinking that being the humble man that he was, Moses himself would have said, quite right, the return to Canaan will be my legacy, and now it's time for Israel to move on. And Israel will move on. But after all they've been through with Moses, not yet. Verse 8 tells us that Israelites waited for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Yes, they loved their leader, and it would take a full month to mourn his memory. But then it came to an end. And that ought to be true in our own lives. So go ahead, mourn, cry your eyes out, weep for your loss. It's the one time you can do it. But when a man of God dies, nothing of God dies. When he pulls up one plant, he has another ready to bloom. And when he takes control, he blesses. He approves when we seek his counsel for a replacement. So when Moses prayed that God would as his replacement, it was God who told him in Numbers chapter 27, verse 18, "Take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him." By doing this in front of the priest and all the people, Moses let it be publicly known that he supported this man. Yes, Moses would be a tough act for anyone to follow. But Joshua has nothing to worry about. God is in control, and Moses is and Joshua is right where he ought to be. Verse 9 tells us that Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. So Moses' story has ended. But the Israelite story goes on. And it's a final tribute to Moses that all this happened seamlessly. All his great achievements have been for nothing. And while no gravestone will ever mark his resting place, perhaps the final lines of Deuteronomy can serve as his epitaph. Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord some deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel. Now, I don't know any centenarian, but my impression is that most of them are unlikely to be in the best of health. And not many mountain climbers are in their 90s either. Here's Moses at 120, and he doesn't even need glasses. He didn't spend his final years in genteel retirement. He just kept moving on. He didn't waste a single minute. So are you over 60? If you are, then how is your walk with Jesus Christ? Are you still on speaking terms? Do you still carry his book around? Are you still reading it? And if you're under 60 and your answer's also no, then what's your excuse? Moses knew God personally. His life was a face-to-face walk of dedication. gave his life length. His humility, despite his achievements, gave his life breadth. And keeping all his trials and hardship in perspective, gave it depth. I have no any medical knowledge, but what I did notice in a colleague who suffered from depression was that he lost all sense of perspective when struck. It would be easy to think that because of his achievements, Moses was someone who possessed superhuman powers. But he wasn't. He was just a mortal man like anyone else. He just used his time more efficiently than most. And as he was still in good health, he didn't need to die. So the question here is, are you ready? Time left. 10, 20, 50 years maybe. Okay then, try this little exercise. It's very simple, but it might just surprise you. Statistics tell us that on average, we're now most likely to die at the age of 80. So, take the year of your birth and add on 80. And whatever year that comes to, you don't have to shout it out, just say it quietly to yourself. Maybe it's 2022, 2030, 2043, it might even be 2067. But whatever year it was, when you know what? That's sooner than I thought. Because when you can name a year, it becomes a lot less abstract, a lot more urgent. Of course, your answer was 2015. Then I'm afraid you've been dead for 2 years now. But well done on making it today. Okay, it's not a very scientific exercise, but a golfer might say that's par. In any event, however you look at it, time is short. You might not even shoot par. So please, don't delay. Moses lived to 120, and he was a great leader. He didn't seek it, but God chose him for the role, and Moses accepted it. But even Moses was not indispensable. Once his work was completed, he passed on the reins of office to his successor Joshua and left the scene quietly and without fuss, so the work could continue under a new leader without Moses' shadow hanging over him. Perhaps the parting gift of a great leader. It's something our own church tries to emulate in its approach to leadership. So how appropriate that we're marking a number of things today. The departure of Keith, and we wish him all the best for the future, wherever God chooses to take him. It's also the first anniversary of William's first service in St. Mark's Church, as some of you may remember. And this afternoon, Luke Burden will take her first step on the road to leading her own parish. She has accepted God's challenge just as Moses did over 3,000 years ago. And she comes here to a strange new parish. Some stranger than others, perhaps. But one with a long tradition for preparing great leaders in the Church of Ireland. So please, remember her today. If you can, and support her. But if you can't make it, then remember her in your prayers today. Because like Moses, like ourselves, she's just an ordinary person with all the strengths, weaknesses, hopes and fears we all share. And if Lucy should feel the need of a biblical role model, she could do worse than look to Moses, a man who made many personal sacrifices to answer God's call and became a great leader by obeying God's will. He saw to it that Moses escaped the sentence of death imposed by the king of the day, Pharaoh, on all the newborn Hebrew boys in Egypt. So right from the start of his life, we see an echo of an even greater one to come, that of Jesus Christ. Both would spend time in the wilderness before their mission began, be that 40 days or 40 years. And of course, the very events of the crucifixion and resurrection would take place during the Passover festival that marked the hugely significant event that was central to the Exodus story. And in our reading today, we have Moses went on to pray that God would reconsider his decision to Canaan, just as in the same way Jesus prayed that the cup might pass from him. And just as Jesus acquiesced with the words, "Father, thy will be done," so Moses, as a humble and obedient servant when his request was refused too, would speak no more of the matter. And at the very end, when God brought Moses to the mountaintop and showed him all the land of Canaan, this was very much what the devil chose to mimic and then tried to outdo when he showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the world from yet another high mountain in one of his 3 temptations in the wilderness. So as we bring our study of Exodus to a close, again, we're reminded of the rector's phrase that links our examination of the covenant and the story of Moses with the central story of the New Testament, namely, that the new is in the old concealed, the old is in the new revealed. Now, before I finish, bear with me, I have one last brief story. And I'm indebted to one of our evening service parishioners who told me this a few weeks ago. It concerns that famous Cecil B. DeMille movie, The 10 Commandments, probably the most famous of the old biblical epics. It's a fact, today, but still an impressive spectacle. The parting of the Red Sea is still one of the great cinematic moments, even before the days of CGI special effects. It's surprisingly accurate too, with those great walls of water on either side of the Israelites, pretty much as it's actually described in the Bible. And I was fortunate enough to actually see it on a big screen. Back in the 1970s, it was shown in our own parochial hall. One of our parishioners actually put it on a very professional screen. However, my story goes back to the London premiere in the 1950s. A glamorous affair, no doubt, attended by a host of celebrities. And as the great and good of the day came out of the cinema after the film ended, an enterprising young journalist spotting the Bishop of London immediately thought of a angle, and he made a beeline to the common cleric, hoping to elicit an ecclesiastical view of Hollywood's take on this great Bible story. "What did you think of the movie, Your Grace?" he hastily asked, to which the bishop, after a moment's careful reflection, replied, "Oh, very good indeed. But you know, the book was better." Amen to that. Read the book.